The horrifying truth about the Black Death, ashes at the threshold. Picture the scene. It is October 1347, and a fleet of Genoese trading ships drifts silently into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The sails hang limp. No sailors call out. When the harbor authorities finally board, they find something that will haunt Europe for centuries. Most of the crew are dead. The survivors are covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus, their skin mottled with dark purple blotches. Within hours, those men are dead too. The Sicilian officials order the ships expelled from the port, but it is already too late. The rats have come ashore. The fleas have jumped. And a microscopic killer named Yersinia pestis has begun its march across a continent. Within 5 years, between 25 and 50 million Europeans will be dead. That is up to half of every person alive on the continent. Entire villages will vanish from maps. Priests will refuse to hear final confessions. Mothers will abandon children in the streets. And civilization itself will nearly collapse under the weight of the bodies. This was the Black Death. And what the chronicles reveal about those years is far more disturbing than anything you were taught in school. Let's uncover the dark truth. A world waiting to burn. To understand why the Black Death killed so efficiently, you have to understand the world it entered. Europe in 1347 was already a tinderbox soaked in oil. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had starved the continent for 2 brutal years, driven by relentless rains that rotted crops in the fields. Survivors were malnourished, immune systems shattered, and populations packed into filthy, overcrowded cities without sewers, running water, or any understanding of germ theory. The medical establishment of the 14th century was, to put it plainly, useless against what was coming. Physicians still followed the teachings of Galen, a Greek doctor who had died over 1,000 years earlier. They believed disease came from imbalanced humors in the body, or from foul-smelling air called miasma. Their treatments included bloodletting, applying dried toads to swollen lymph nodes, and burning aromatic herbs to purify the atmosphere. None of it worked. None of it could work. And then there was the church, the single most powerful institution in medieval life. When plague struck, people did what they had always done in a crisis. They ran to the priests. They lit candles. They organized processions where hundreds of people walked shoulder to shoulder through the streets, praying, weeping, breathing on each other. In doing so, they created the perfect conditions for the disease to spread even faster. The historian Ole Benedictau, who spent decades studying plague mortality records, estimates that roughly 60% of Europe's total population died between 1346 and 1353. 60%. Imagine every second person you know gone within 4 years. That was the world the Black Death made. And what happened inside that world was worse than any horror story. The anatomy of a killer. Let's begin with the disease itself. Because the medieval reality was more horrifying than the myths. The Black Death was not one illness but 3, working in terrifying combination. The bubonic form caused the famous swellings called buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck, some reportedly growing as large as apples. These were lymph nodes flooded with bacteria, and when they burst, the smell was so overpowering that entire households abandoned the dying. Picture standing at the doorway of a plague victim's room in 1348. The stench hits you first, a mixture of rotting flesh, sweat, and something metallic. The victim on the bed is barely recognizable. Their fingers, toes, and nose have turned black as charcoal, tissue dying from massive internal bleeding. This blackening of the extremities is what eventually gave the disease its name, though contemporaries usually called it the Great Mortality or the Pestilence. But bubonic plague was actually the slow, survivable version. Roughly 30 to 60% of bubonic victims lived. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, killed nearly 100% of the infected within 3 days. It spread through the air in a single cough, a single conversation. And then there was septicemic plague, the rarest and most terrifying, which flooded the bloodstream directly. Victims could go to bed feeling healthy and be dead by morning, their skin turning purple-black in the final hours. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, recorded something chilling in the introduction to his Decameron. He wrote of pigs rooting through the rags of dead paupers thrown into the streets, then dropping dead themselves within minutes as if poisoned. That single observation, written in 1353, tells us how fast this disease could kill. Faster than almost anything humanity had ever encountered, and it was only just beginning. The cities that ate themselves, but here's where it gets even more disturbing. The plague did not just kill people. It broke the machinery of civilization itself. In Florence, one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, an estimated 60% of the population died in the first outbreak. Boccaccio described bodies stacked in the streets like cargo, and mass graves dug so deep and so wide that layers of corpses were separated by only thin sprinkles of dirt, as one makes lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese. That comparison, from a man who watched it happen, is one of the most haunting sentences in all of medieval literature. In Avignon, the city that housed the Pope himself, an estimated half the population perished. Pope Clement VI, on the advice of his personal physician Guy de Chauliac, sat between two enormous fires in his chambers day and night. Historians now believe the intense heat may have actually driven fleas away, meaning the Pope survived by accident, following useless medical theory that happened to work. Clement also did something remarkable. He officially declared that Jews were not responsible for the plague, trying to stop the massacre sweeping across Europe. That command was almost entirely ignored. In Paris, city officials recorded 800 deaths per day at the peak. In Siena, construction of the great cathedral simply stopped. Workers dead or fled, and the unfinished walls still stand today as a monument to what was lost. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that in the town of Leicester, there died in the small parish of St. Leonard more than 380 people, in the parish of Holy Cross more than 400, in the parish of St. Margaret more than 700. Imagine walking down a familiar street where you knew every Korean neighbor. Now imagine 7 of every 10 doors marked with a white cross, meaning the plague has taken everyone inside. That was daily life in 1349. The cities were eating themselves alive. The hunt for a scapegoat. Brace yourself, because the human response to the plague was, in many ways, more horrifying than the disease. When people cannot explain a catastrophe, they invent enemies to blame. And in 14th century Europe, that meant one thing above all others: the Jews. Beginning in 1348, a monstrous conspiracy theory spread through the German-speaking lands. Jews, it was claimed, had poisoned the wells to kill Christians. Never mind that Jewish communities were dying of plague at the same rate as everyone else. Never mind that the accusation made no logical sense. Fear does not require logic. It requires a target. In February 1349, in the city of Strasbourg, roughly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the Jewish cemetery on Valentine's Day. The city council had actually tried to protect them, but the guilds overthrew the council and carried out the massacre anyway. In Basel, the entire Jewish community was locked inside a wooden building on an island in the Rhine and set on fire. In Mainz, one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe was annihilated. Historians have documented more than 200 Jewish communities destroyed between 1348 and 1351, often before the plague had even reached those towns. Here's the detail that transforms this from tragedy to something even darker. Many of the massacres were not spontaneous mob violence. They were organized, planned, and financially motivated. Local nobles and merchants who owed money to Jewish lenders discovered that dead lenders could not collect debts. The plague became a convenient cover for economic murder on a continental scale. And it was not only Jews. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and women accused of witchcraft were all hunted in various regions. In some Italian cities, mobs attacked anyone who looked sick, dragging them from their homes and stoning them in the streets. The philosopher Hannah Arendt would centuries later coin a phrase for this pattern of human behavior in crisis. She called it the banality of evil. The Black Death gave the world one of its earliest and clearest lessons in how quickly civilization can turn on itself. The Doctors of Death. Now let's step into the strangest and most iconic figure of the entire plague era. The Beaked Doctor. You have seen the image. Alongside isopods, I introduce springtails and horrifying bird-like mass with glass eyes and a curved beak stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and vinegar-soaked sponges. Popular imagination places this figure at the heart of the Black Death. But here is a detail almost no one knows. The Beaked Plague Doctor costume did not actually exist during the 1347 outbreak. It was invented nearly 300 years later in 1619 by a French physician named Charles Delorme, who served King Louis X. 59 Charles Delorme, who served King Louis X. 0. Delorme designed the outfit as protective gear during a later plague outbreak, believing the herbs in the beak would filter the miasma from the air. By the time of the Great Plague of London in 1665, the costume had spread across Europe, and it has haunted our imagination ever since. However, real plague doctors did exist during the Black Death, and their story is heartbreaking. Cities like Venice, Pavia, and Florence hired physicians on contracts specifically to treat plague victims when everyone else fled. These men were often young, inexperienced, or desperate because established doctors refused the work. Their contracts required them to live in isolation, to touch no one but the sick, and often to remain in the city for years without seeing their families. Many died. Some ran away. A few became wealthy from the enormous fees. All of them worked with medical tools that could not save a single life. Picture yourself as a plague doctor entering a home in Milan in 1348. The family watches you from doorways with a terrible mixture of hope and hatred. You lance the buboes with a hot iron. You apply crushed herbs. You bleed the patient with leeches. You know none of it will help. And when the patient dies, as they almost always do, the family blames you. This was medicine in the age of the great mortality, a profession of feudal courage. The world the plague made hears what almost no one knows about the Black Death. It did not just kill, it transformed. When the dying finally stopped in 1353, the survivors woke up in a completely different world. And some of the changes were, astonishingly, for the better. Before the plague, most European peasants were serfs, bound to the land of their lords for life. Labor was cheap because people were plentiful. But when half the workforce died, the survivors suddenly held extraordinary power. A peasant who once earned a pittance could now demand triple wages, better food, and freedom of movement. The Statute of Labourers, passed in England in 1351, tried desperately to force wages back down to pre-plague levels. It failed completely. Within a generation, serfdom in Western Europe was crumbling. In 1381, this new peasant consciousness exploded into the English Peasants' Revolt, led by a former soldier named Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball. Ball famously preached, "When Adam delved in Eve's span, who was then the gentleman?" That single sentence, quoted in the Chronicles of Thomas Walsingham, became one of the earliest cries for social equality in European history. It could only have been spoken in a world remade by mass death. The church, too, was permanently damaged. When priests died alongside their parishioners, when prayers went unanswered, when processions only spread the disease further, people began to question, not their faith in God, but their faith in the institution. Historians now trace a direct line from the Black Death to the reforms of John Wycliffe in the 1370s to Jan Hus in the early 1400s, and eventually to Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. The Reformation itself was, in part, a delayed aftershock of the plague. Even art transformed. The cheerful religious paintings of the early 1300s gave way to obsessive, terrifying imagery of death. Skeletons dancing with kings, rotting corpses beside living lovers. The famous Danse Macabre motif was born in the ashes of the Black Death. A reminder etched into every cathedral wall that death comes for all, regardless of rank. What the bones remember. Step back for a moment and consider what the Black Death really teaches us. Not the numbers, not the horror, the deeper truth beneath the bones. For centuries, historians assumed the plague was so overwhelming that no one could have understood it. No one could have adapted. But recent research has changed that picture entirely. In 2011, scientists working with skeletal remains from the East Smithfield Plague Pit in London successfully sequenced the DNA of Yersinia pestis from a 1348 victim. What they found was extraordinary. The bacterium of 1348 was not dramatically more lethal than modern strains. What made it apocalyptic was not the microbe. It was the world it entered. A world without sanitation, without antibiotics, without accurate science, and above all, without the humility to admit how little was understood. That is the profound lesson buried in these events. Pandemics are never purely biological. They are social, economic, and psychological. The same disease that killed half of Europe in 1348 is treatable today with a course of antibiotics costing a few dollars. What separates catastrophe from inconvenience is not the pathogen. It is the civilization that meets it. And there is a warning in that truth. Every generation likes to believe it has escaped the fears of the past, that our science, our medicine, our institutions have made US safe. The people of 1347 believed something similar. They lived in what they considered the height of Christian civilization. They had cathedrals, universities, and legal codes. And yet, when the ships came into Messina harbor, none of it saved them. What saved humanity, eventually, was not prayer. It was knowledge, slowly, painfully, accumulated over centuries. That is the inheritance the plague dead left behind, purchased at a price that still staggers the imagination. The weight of 50 million. So let's gather everything we've uncovered. A merchant fleet arriving in Sicily, a microscopic bacterium riding on fleas, cities collapsing under piles of corpses, massacres of innocent scapegoats, doctors in useless costumes doing hopeless work, and out of that darkness somehow a new world being born. Higher wages, weakened feudalism, a shaken church, the first stirrings of the Renaissance. The deepest lesson here is that human beings are shaped as much by our catastrophes as by our triumphs. Everything you take for granted today, from modern medicine to workers' rights to religious freedom, has roots that reach back through soil fertilized by plague dead. We are, quite literally, the descendants of the survivors. In our own century, we have lived through a pandemic that reminded us how thin the wall between normal life and chaos really is. The people of 1348 would recognize much of what we experienced. The fear, the scapegoating, the heroes and cowards, the strange, unwanted transformation of everyday life. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes, and the Black Death still whispers to us across 7 centuries. If this story moved you, if you want to keep uncovering the truths behind the myths of the medieval world, subscribe to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. Every week, we bring you the verified history that textbooks skip and Hollywood distorts. And in the comments below, I want to hear from you. If you had lived in a village in 1348 and the plague was approaching, would you have stayed to care for your family or fled to the countryside to survive? There is no easy answer. But the answer you give reveals something about you. Until next time, never forget, the dead do not truly die as long as we remember what they endured to bring us here. A note on this history. The events described in this video are drawn from chronicles, court records, and modern archaeological research. The Black Death remains one of the most devastating events in human history, and every life lost represents a story we can never fully recover. We share these histories not to sensationalize suffering, but to honor those who endured it, and to recognize how far human society has come in understanding the diseases that once seemed like divine punishment. May their memory endure.